Hey everybody, welcome to DBS Films Podcast. My name is Kellen. With me as always is my brother Brendan. Together we make movies with DBS Films. Today's episode, we're going into our thoughts on the current writer strikes part two. This episode, we're going to highlight some of the differences and really what we think our outcome's going to be, as well as what is the role that AI will play in screenwriting. As that being said, be sure to take a look at our Discord channel online. We make movies for our fans, with our fans. If you ever want to be part of the action, part of the scenes, part of the fun, that is the place to be. We have open auditions for all of the features that we make, and you'll have an opportunity to be in one of our newest horror movies. We also have The Forest of Death, which is on Amazon Prime. Be sure to take a look at it. You rent and review it. It means the world to us because that means we can make more movies. So we are picking up on the second episode with the first one that we ended up having. It was really a case of what the current overall landscape was, how that was shifting, because that plays a massive, massive feature in essentially what's going on between the writers and what's going on between the streamers and the studios. And I think the first thing I want to mention is this was really a can that got kicked down the road a lot because of COVID. 3 years ago was when they kind of had initial negotiations and they really kind of just said, hey, things are normal. Let's continue moving. So basically, this was something where this has kind of been on the minds of everyone. Really what ends up happening is every 3 years, there is an agreement with the major studios and the screenwriting guild to basically say, hey, this is what's going on. So it was really a status quo phase there. But that being said, the landscape has massively shifted from some of these agreements. And the biggest thing is over new media. And that is AKA the big players that are now on the streaming services. They have had much different terms with the Writers Guild since the start of new media. And at first the concept was, well, these streamers are just starting up. We don't know if it's going to be successful. We don't know if it's going to work. We don't know what's going to happen. So let's have less residuals. Let's have less, strict minimums and things that we have in the film industry and the TV. And surprise, surprise, what is now the dominating force in media? It is these new media streamers. So now when you're coming up to bat with this new contract negotiations, it's really not for, these next 3 years. It's to try and set the tone for the next decade, because the big behemoths now are no longer your studios. It's these streamers. So you want to talk about how new media has come up, how it's risen, and there hasn't really been a big debate about what these new terms would be because of that delay from COVID.
Yeah, I mean, it's just last time this strike happened, I don't think the writers got exactly what they wanted. I think they caved a little bit too early. And I think this one's absolutely crucial. The landscape has changed so dramatically since 2008 that I don't think anyone could have seen this coming. So not only do I think that the writers got, not as good of a deal as they should have gotten, but things changed so quickly and so fast that they didn't, no one could have predicted this kind of stuff. Where you had, back then it was DVDs and movies. DVDs died, movies had a huge hit, and instead of giant movie studios, you had streaming companies explode. And so there really was no residuals for some of these things. Some of the deals were kind of, a little funky. So now, the writers come to bat and they say, like, look, this is a landscape. I think they have a good idea of where it could be in 10 years, but that is going to be an issue that they need to decide. They really got to put their foot in the ground and say, like, look, this is what we deserve, and this is what's going to happen. Because if anything is going to survive as far as the Hollywood model, it's going to keep going towards these streaming companies. And I don't think there's going to be to start a small streaming service is extremely, extremely difficult. So if anything, there's going to be consolidation. Anytime there's consolidation, then you almost get like a monopolization of the streaming platforms, and it makes competition harder, and there's less jobs, and it's just not good for anybody. So I think they need to create a competitive environment so that writers are getting bid for the best services. There's a lot of jobs out there, and there's training for writers to, be involved in writers' rooms and stay, active on a lot of these shows. So that's going to be the big thing, is just making sure there's jobs, there's placement, there's continual work for writers, moving forward the next 10 years. And then the other thing is obviously automation, AI, and what that role does with, moving forward as far as, can writers use AI? Can studios use AI? Where does this go? Because literally, I remember back in Thanksgiving, I was playing around with AI, just the original chat model. And I was like, all right, this can't write books. It's good for like searching stuff, I guess. And then lo and behold, 4 months later, you had the 4.0 version come out, and it still can't write anything. It's a little bit wonky, but the jump from 3 to 4 is very alarming, and I think that it's kinda got everyone on edge because, you just don't want that kind of thing in Hollywood. You don't want creative ideas to be generated by a robot, and that's just not this is a very dystopian topic, and, we make horror and dystopia movies and books, but it's scary, and I think there needs to be, roadblocks in place. There needs to be guidelines for this thing, and the whole debate of this thing's essentially trained by reading a ton of screenplays and books for free that have just been uploaded to it with no compensation to the authors. Well, in my mind, that does not seem very fair at all.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of big question marks, and I think the problem is answering those questions. By the time you get around to it, there's going to be whole new questions to ask and answer as the developments happen. I think there's also two other big things that I want to kind of highlight, which is why this is going to be such a huge battle, in my opinion. I'm going to go ahead and call it right now. I think this is going to be the longest writer's strike that we have. I think it's easily going to go past the 100-day mark, and I think it's going to be pretty brutal. And here's my reason for that. Again, I'm fully supportive of the writers. I believe creatives deserve more, but unfortunately, we have a lot of new players in the industry. And I think the first thing that's kind of making this much different than before is you have these streaming services that are beholden to their shareholders, but not just streamers where it's, Netflix is kind of, one of the major ones that's strictly streaming. But you also have Amazon and Apple TV. And the big thing with Amazon and Apple and some of these larger companies is the streaming element of their business is so tiny that the only reason they want to be in there is just to have some skin in the game so that you can be part of their ecosystem. That's all they really care about. I mean, Apple TV is putting in $1 billion to try and get more movies in theater. $1 billion is like what? A few days of revenue for Apple? It's a drop in the bucket compared to the past strikes where you are mainly looking with writers when it comes to, or when you're mainly looking with studios who, they need to produce content. If they don't produce content, things gridlock. Even Netflix has access to, worldwide content. They can be creative with what they have. They have a whole stockpile of library. So they have all these options, which means they can really shore up and last. And I think the second of the landscapes that is kind of making it really tricky and challenging is just the current economic settings. You have streamers. You just mentioned in the last episode, Disney just got hit big because of their subscriptions. Netflix had a massive correction, even though it's kind of pulling back now. But there's a lot of these things where the talk of a lot of Wall Street companies and these bigger players is, how do we shore up expenses? How do we pull back? And on top of that, you have inflation running wild. So you have basically the writers who are feeling the pressure when it comes to the cost of living and how long can they go without having a strike. So I think the new landscape of these streamers having the power now, and also the current economic conditions, have really made it for, unfortunately, in my opinion, a very disadvantaged position for the writers to be at.
Yeah, I think this one's gonna be tough, and I think that, the writers are still, they understand what happened last time. They understand that it can't happen this time. But I mean, they do have leverage. These streaming platforms have prided themselves on having a lot of content. Like Netflix is like, we're doing new releases every single week. All these platforms are making new stuff. And it really wasn't that good stuff, but it was content. It was stuff to watch. You have to justify that $12 a month. And right now you have a soft economy, and the first thing to go is those $12 subscriptions. So these streamers are losing money hand over fist. And now if the content dries up, well, that's a huge issue. It's going to come down to how much cash they have. But for the first time, Netflix has to answer to shareholders. And that's a new thing. Those shareholders are going to be like, hey, you guys are not producing any content. What's going on? And at that point, they're going to say, Netflix, do whatever you need to do to, get these writers back on board. So that's good for the writers. The issue on the writers thing is like, they're asking for a lot. I think they're asking for $480 million or $1 billion, or can't remember how much it was. And the studios counter with like 40. Like there's a big delta in between those two things. And so you're asking for a lot of money and well-deserved stuff. All the stuff they requested is fair, but you're asking it from streaming platforms that are just trying to cut everything right now. They're trying to get rid of everything, they're trying to cut costs. And that is not a good situation. So I think we're going to have a pretty long standstill here. But I do think we're going to come out of this a little bit stronger. The issue that I see right now is I just don't know how viable this streaming platform service industry stuff is right now, because now when Netflix came out, they said $7 and you can watch all the TV shows and movies that you want. And it made it easy. It was so successful because it was easy because you cut your $100 cable bill and paid $7 and got unlimited content that you could watch whenever you wanted. Well, fast forward 10 more years and you have Disney Plus, you have Hulu, you have Netflix, you have HBO, you have Stars, you have Showtime, you have YouTube TV. You're right back to $100 for less content than you had with 100 cable channels, right? So that model is not working anymore. And I don't know what's going to come out of that. And I was very bullish on Tubi. I still remain very bullish on Tubi. But what is Tubi? It's just cable TV. So it's, we're right back to watching ads. But, something's going to change. Something's going to shift. But I do think whether it's, going direct to customer, whether that's the brand for a lot of these smaller studios, whether it's, creating, because really video hosting has come down so much that it's easy. Like we could host our stuff on a website and just send viewers to it. The difference is you really need a lot of viewers to essentially make your money back. But I'm wondering if that's kind of an option. I do see like maybe some kind of service coming and curating all these things. So you get like Netflix and HBO and all this stuff at discounted rates. That's kind of what Amazon Prime's trying to do with their channel service. The problem with the Amazon Prime is what Kel said. They just don't care. The video team has no assets or resources. They don't care. They just see it as a loss leader, which is very sad, because if there's anyone that could really kind of step up and really kind of curate this area and really help out with both the writers and the studios, it would be Amazon. But they're too busy, slinging products and stuff and selling AWS. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't know how it's going to happen, but we're going to remain flexible, and, however it plays out, we're going to try and, position DBS as a company to be in the best position possible for obviously the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's really going to be interesting. So to kind of counter that, I think one of the big ones that I see the benefit that the writers have, like as a positive going into this, is, there is a potential for a solidarity amongst the creatives. We're kind of already seeing that now. For instance, like the Duffer Brothers and Stranger Things, really the issue is you can't have anyone writing on something. So if you have a finished script, there's nothing stopping you from filming said script. So you could, if you have a pipeline, and like I know a lot of studios have been doing this, they've been building up basically their catalog so they can continue for a few months without any kind of notice. You got your late night TV shows are off, but I mean, everyone's basically saying like good riddance to the late night, at least what I'm seeing. But it's really one of those things where like you have abilities to kind of go for a few months there. I think the big catalyst for putting pressure on the studios comes when if you get things like the DGA, which is the Directors Guild of America, their negotiations have actually started 2 days ago, and I believe they have to have a contract or something in the middle of next month. If they show solidarity with the writers and they say, hey, we're no longer directing, well, then that's going to impact the ability. If you're part of the DGA, then you're no longer directing to create content. And then on top of that, the big one that we've been talking about is SAG. And SAG's the Screen Actors Guild, which comes up in August. And I would say the Screen Actors Guild by far has the most solidarity with the writers, because they typically work with the writers. And a lot of actors are actors/writers. You look at things like The Office. You look at a lot of the modern day comedies. You look at like Always Sunny in Philadelphia. You look at those, basically it's a combination of being a writer and an actor, which is what we kind of talked about earlier, in the sense of you have to almost have multifaceted. So there could be a case that come August, you have all of the creatives against the studios. And that is when there is a deadlock grind of creation and you're almost floating with finished products. So that could be kind of, in my opinion, if the Writers Guild continues and like all the full forces and you get a total war, that's what that situation looks like to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I spent the last week, pitching Into the Forest to try and find a home with distribution. And I always ask them, what their thoughts are as far as, being distribution companies and in charge of taking these indie movies and putting them on different platforms. And the consensus is like, everything's fine until 9 to 12 months out. That's the lag that you have in this industry between finishing a product and then, have 3 to 6 months of post-production and then 3 months to get it ready for distribution. So right now in this system, where the writer's strike was in May, 9 months from May is when the streaming platforms are going to start to feel a little bit of pressure. And it needs to get that far to essentially kind of hurt them. So that's another downside to this, is that writers kind of know that too, and they got to kind of push out there. What's kind of weird is that what Kel said is true, which is the DGA's there and the SAG, if they all can, band together, they can probably get a really good deal done. And this time around, I think SAG is really on the writer's side. I think what we talked about before in the last podcast, where people are wearing multiple hats. So you have actors who are directors, you have actors who are writers. This kind of consolidation, which helped out the studios for a long time because they only needed to pay, a certain amount of fees, and you didn't have to bring on more writers because you're kind of using people who had multiple hats, and that was a benefit to the studio, is now going to come back to hurt them. Because why would, if you're a writer, why would you make a deal with SAG that's a little bit detrimental to your writer's friend or your writer hat? So I think everything can kind of come together, and it's going to be really interesting come September to see what kind of, happens. But you have 9 months of backlog of catalog and everything. Once it gets to that mark, then you're going to start to see content kind of disappear. And it could be good for indies. Netflix and some of the studios which kind of turned their back on indies might be so desperate for content that they'll start to allow that stuff to come back in. Be really good for Netflix to kind of bolster their ad model by sharing that revenue with indie films. That's a very good idea. But at the same time, it could also be very, very bad where the consumers are just like, look, Netflix and all these shows cost too much. They're not producing things. I'm just going to turn them off and, spend my time watching YouTube or, go back to books or podcasts. And a lot of these services could get hurt pretty bad. So, there is good and there's bad out there. I don't think movies are going to go away, but I know, the last time that we had this kind of crazy writer's strike, it did affect indies pretty hard. And, it took away a lot of, really good quality movies got hurt. And then we had the rise of, reality TV show. And you might be a big fan of reality TV, but I mean, for me, it's not really the stuff that we want to be kind of pushing. So that kind of took away a lot of really cool TV shows, and they're replaced by, other stuff. And I think what it was like Discovery or TLC, one of these channels now is just all reality TV. When like back in my day, it was like cool war stuff and like actual learning stuff. And now we got, just a whole bunch of, I don't even know. I don't have cable, so I have no idea what's on there. But I know a couple of years ago, it was all, reality TV.
Oh man, RIP History Channel went from one of the most fascinating documentaries that I love watching to Swamp Road trucker logger people. It was insane. So yeah, I mean, that's something that people talk about, is the rise of reality TV. So with the rest of the episode, what I really kind of want to highlight is the differences that the studios have and the differences that the writers have. So one of the big ones that you mentioned, the writers basically through their analysis are looking for about $480 million in additional compensation based on what the new terms that they have. One of the big sticking points that they've been having is like going after the CEOs of like Netflix and Warner Media. Like one of the Warner Media CEOs, he's getting like $250 million in compensation. So that's been a sticky point that they've been kind of pointing to, of like, hey, the money is there. So that's kind of their angle that they're going for, trying to size up the differences. As you mentioned, there's a big difference because the studios were like, hey, we'll give you $40 million more, is basically what they were countering with. So only a 10x difference is what we're looking at, but a lot of these things are setting precedents. I think the first thing that they're looking to shore up is what's known as the writer's room. And traditionally what you used to have is like you'd have 12 weeks, 14-week commitments when it comes to being in a writer's room for a TV show or something like that. And essentially what would happen is you'd be able to take this amount of pay. And I think they were saying like the average, pay for the week was almost like $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. So that, to most people sounds like a lot. But that 12-week stretch was basically what your chunk was for the year. And then you'd come back to the writer's room and you would, continue on the next season. what's happened is you went from, 20 episode seasons, 12 episode seasons to now what you see on the streaming services of the 8 episode seasons. And what the streaming services have been able to do is what they're called mini rooms now, where they basically would not have a full writer's room. They would have smaller teams of writers. So instead of maybe, 10 writers, you go to 3 or 4 writers. And now you have the showrunner who's basically the only one kind of in charge of it. That's farming the script out to writers to basically make it more of like a gig type thing where it's like, hey, if I farm this script out to 4 or 5 writers, they give me the best thing. And me as a showrunner, I cultivate the ideas. Here's the finished product. I've now taken a 20-person room of 12 weeks of pay and I shortened it to 8 weeks or 4 weeks or 5 weeks, because again, they just need to get the finished product of the script with 3 to 4 people. So there has been a big compression of it and it's going there. But to counter this, the terms that the writers have been saying is you need to have a writer's room no matter what for pre-production. You need to have a writer's room no matter what for post-production. So they're basically saying to the studios, even if there's no writing taking place whatsoever, you have to pay our writers. So that's a big conflict point. You want to kind of weigh in on the differences that you have here? Because when I look at it at the writer's side of things, yes, you no longer have a livelihood in the sense of like, the career status of it because of the inconsistency in the pay. But when I look at it from the studios, hat, why am I paying you for something that I necessarily don't need you for? Because of advances in technology, because of advances platform of the media, because we now have 8 episodes versus 12 episodes. Like all of these things are kind of the wane.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to like looking at the both sides. It's hard to tell like what stuff is just in there as like a negotiation tactic. Like the whole thing where the writers have to be involved in the post production is just like I'm like that's just something they're like, oh yeah, we'll give up that, but we want this. Like I just don't see why you need writers in post production unless there is like active rewrites, and that might be what that is. Because the slide or whatever I was looking at wasn't very clear to me. If I'm doing something in post production editing, I do not want writers anywhere near that. Like that's the last thing. Is just a completely different thing. Now, if you have to do rewrites or fix things up, then yeah, I could see that. But I don't think that's necessarily the case in all movies. Some movies, that are done properly don't need to have rewrites or pickups or anything like that. So I don't know exactly like the clarity on that. Once again, I'm not like fully understanding of all the details other than like the couple slides that I looked at. But so some of that stuff could be negotiating tactics. But I do think like Zoom kind of killed the writers' rooms a little bit. You can easily Zoom and be on writers' rooms. And is that really a writer's room? Like, what is the definition of a writer's room? And I do think that what the writers are doing is smart though, because you want to have a lot of writers. Like that's how you cultivate talent. That's how you have talent. And that's how you get these, new writers and new ideas going. As a studio, I would love to, like my dream would be have like 50 writers in a writer's room, because you can really find the best ideas and kind of bounce things off everyone's head and get the best script possible. Our whole company philosophy is we listen to every single idea, no matter how good or bad it is. There really is no bad idea. They're just ideas. And then it's just my job to filter which ones I want to go with. It's just a personal preference on which ones I want. So to me, that's a dream essentially. The problem is you can't ask for full payment for all these guys to be paid like senior, writers' room writers. Like, I think that that's the issue, is that that's a huge cost. If you're paying, everyone $5,000 a week and you have a 10-person writing room, it's a $50,000 cost a week. And if you're saying, all right, 90 days, 6 months to, flesh out a script and get something really good, that's $500,000 just in writing fees. And I think that that's kind of aggressive. So I don't know if it's going to come down to that, just depending on like the project that you make, you have to allocate a certain amount of money to a writer's room, and then they kind of figure out how they want to allocate that to the writers. That's like a nice compromise that might be able to hit, where like you have to spend X on the writers. But it's very unique and how these things do. And I think the big things like residuals with TV, every episode that got paid or played, the writers would get residuals. With streaming, they kind of changed the definition of like what a TV episode is and how the residuals are paid out. And obviously you have clever accounting, which is what Hollywood does to people who get back end points on the net instead of the gross. The gross would be the overall revenue, which is what you're supposed to do. You get it on the net. Well, guess what? Every single movie you've ever seen probably makes $0 because they take it all away somehow. And I think that streaming services probably have the same kind of accounting. I see it all the time in distribution. So, how you're going to get clarity on that, how they're going to meet in the middle is going to be up to them. But I do think that there's ground for negotiation. It just is a little bit surprising to see them so far off from the original negotiations, because they've been negotiating before the strike. And when they came out with the terms on the strike day, it was like, oh, wow, they are like pretty far away. When you have the studios saying, how they're going to handle AI by just giving AI training classes, that's kind of like a slap in the face. So I don't know how I'm sure that didn't go over well at all with the writers.
Oh yeah, and we'll cover that one at the end. I think the last thing I want to make, a comment on in the current one that they have is, you brought up the residuals and you brought up that. I want to kind of make it clear that I think another element of the, Wall Street effect, essentially, of these streaming companies and these media companies is, again, you are beholden to the shareholders. And you know what's better than profits? More profits. And you know what we want now that we got profits? More profits. And the best way, unfortunately, in the creative industry, yes, everyone wants to make a hit. Everyone wants to make the best show ever. I don't think anyone shows up to be like, let's just make a crappy show that flops. Everyone thinks their idea is going to be big. It's going to be good. But unlike, other businesses where you have a product, you kind of have an idea of how much it sells for. The only thing that's the same with this business now is the expense side of things. And, the best way to ensure that you have the maximum on the bottom line profit, and we talk about it all the time as our production studio, what you can control? You can control the expenses. So when they're dealing with absolutes of the expenses, they're much more laser focused, in my opinion, than the vagueness of what's going to be a successful hit or not. Because, if you think about it now, like all of the writers on these big shows that are getting tons of flack, you see it all the time when people are kind of like complaining about like what's going on, who made this idea. And again, there could be a showrunner who's pulling it one way and these writers are just trying to appease the showrunner or whatnot. But you basically have the cream of the crop that is essentially being criticized a lot now. And you have these streamers that are hyper focused on the expense side of things. I just think that makes it really, really hard. You don't necessarily move the peg back, I feel like, with the stream of business. Once you've, new media has gotten away with residuals not being there for so long, I don't see them going in the opposite way when that affects their bottom line profits, which, as any business knows, that is the most sacred thing. So like, what are kind of your thoughts on that position? Because again, they're asking for essentially a turn back in the time machine, which, one, we've talked about in the beginning, the ecosystem is different. And two, you're going up against the behemoth of these companies that, you're asking them to cut into their profit margin.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Just coming from an investing standpoint, investing as far as like in startups, or an investing as in, or just working with distribution, you kind of get a choice. You get a lump sum and then no back end payments, or you just get back end payments and a percentage of your revenue that you get. Those numbers can move, but you usually don't get both of them, or, you kind of sway to one or the other. And these are all negotiable. So if you want to get a high salary, which is what they're trying to demand, keeping the weekly rates high, then your residuals will be lower. And if you want higher residuals, then obviously you have more skin in the game and you want your pay is going to be lower. So it's going to be interesting to see, like, you can't have it both ways, but there are benefits to the studio to paying residuals. If they pay a lower weekly amount and say, look, we'll raise your residuals up, you can have skin in the game, right? And if this thing really takes off, you have the opportunity to make a lot of money, but your weekly pays are going to be lower. Do the writers kind of agree to that? Because you're betting on yourself. You just can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have a high salary and have skin in the game and get rewarded both ways. It's just, I think those days are done. Like you said, the last writer's strike kind of took away a lot of that stuff. But I think the problem with residuals is, I think the studios want to do it, but the writers have been screwed over so many times by just really bad accounting. And nobody's really holding these companies accountable, which is like this really weird space that a lot of people don't talk about in the filmmaking business. I have no idea if the check that Tubi sends me every month is correct. There's no way for me to audit or account any of this stuff. They're just like, yes, here it is, go. And this is with all the streaming platforms, right? Especially the ones that are paying you, because Tubi would be residual. It's ad-based money that they send me. And Netflix obviously is like one-off deals, but you don't know like if this stuff is good. I have no way to audit these companies. And I assume it's probably the same thing for the writers. They get a check, but they have no idea if that check is good or if they're getting all their money. And so I think that that's kind of an issue that no one really talks about. And I think that's what happened with a lot of the movies. You see horror stories all the time where like actors are suing production theater or production companies because they're like, I was promised, 5 points on this deal and I got 0 because they spent $1 million on craft services because the production company owned the food cart. So there's a lot of creative ways you can do it. And I think like that kind of accountability gives the writers hesitation to go with residuals, but they want that, they want the residuals there because it's a nice steady paycheck and it's residual income. It's the income you want where you don't have to really do any more work and the stuff kind of comes in every month and you can kind of use that for retirement or for savings or for some other stuff. And that's kind of how you build your book as opposed to, having to fight and claw for each job every single month. So it'll be interesting. I don't know where it's going to go. I can see both sides to it, but I think there definitely is going to have to be like some kind of new standard set, some new precedent set to work with these streaming platforms. But I mean, if you're Netflix, you're not going to give any proprietary data on how many people are viewing this movie or your show. So how do you kind of give them residuals when they're saying, look, Netflix buys this stuff and builds it themselves? Like where these residuals are going to come from? I don't know. So it's just a completely different model than, what it was 10 years ago. And like you said, I just don't know if residuals are going to come back to the extent that they did before.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the very, very interesting part is, what that looks like. Because again, I think the ecosystem changed. The last thing I want to talk about, and again, is going to be, the big one in the room, which was like, hey, we don't want any use of AI whatsoever. And the studios were like, we'll have a workshop on it. And that to me means I guarantee you there is a team right now at every of these major studios seeing what they can do with AI, how that can increase it. And I think, again, people are underestimating the power of it. As we mentioned before, you were playing around in October. The new update's much, much better. It's the only time before you get script bot, that's actually designed for it, not just a general, mass language AI. It's specifically designed for this. Opens up a huge Pandora box, opens up that dystopia of, are we just going to have content created by robots for robots, essentially? What's all that fun stuff looking like? But I think the one thing I want to mention is, it's no matter what going to make the job of a writer easier. And I think this has been kind of the big thing I wanted to talk about in the last episode that I think is just going to happen is, again, if you're a writer in the 1930s, what do you have to do? You have to fire up the typewriter, you have to type everything, you make a mistake, you got to manually ink it out, you got to then go, you got to either deliver it. So if you're in Hollywood, you can hand it to someone. If not, you got to ship it to them. And then they go ahead and they get it, they read it, maybe they write notes, they send it back to you. You got to rewrite another one on a typewriter, make copies. That's a whole process in itself. It's a lot of work. Now, you have just the word processors have changed everything. You see the effect of Zoom that has changed everything, and it's only progressing faster. And my point is even if the AI is just used as a tool by a writer to type things out quickly, to brainstorm, to do any of these functions, you now have one writer who is way more powerful at writing than he was before. And it goes back to our original equation where you have a lot of writers who are passionate about it. And if you can have more output than the other writers, you're going to be more valuable. So now you'll have even more writers capable of being writers because of AI. That is only impacting that. So I'm curious on your thoughts. And mainly, like I said, the idea of even how the ball falls when it comes to this, it is going to make people more productive. And more productive means you don't have to pay as much to get as much output. And who's going to benefit from that? The major studios and the businesses. They're going to be the ones to absorb all of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I've had to do the same talk with my writers. Or my day job is publishing, and I have 14 writers that are very scared about AI. And it kind of breaks down into two camps: those who are completely opposed to AI, who are very scared of AI, who are very upset with what's going on, and they have every right to be scared. It's a very, it's completely changing a lot of things. There could be a lot of good and a lot of bad with it. I'm in the camp that this is going to help out writers. I would say the analogy that I've been using is, all right, you're a writer, but you're a farmer, right? So you're growing crops, you're, planting your farm, you understand how to build a farm, how to write a story. And now instead of like using a hoe and rake and shovel to plant your crops, you have a tractor. The AI is tractor. So now you can have a bigger farm, you can harvest faster, you can do better stories, make better crops by using this tool. So that's kind of like what I'm saying is like, look, we're going to wait for this to flesh out, but it definitely is very good at outlining or giving you ideas or kind of, bouncing ideas off, your head. You can use it to as almost like a writing buddy. And that itself is a tool. I would not, and I do not condone using it to completely try and write scripts or books. I'm completely against that, because that's going to lead us down this dystopian cycle of robots just making content, which I don't think is good. And I also think that how it kind of generated and found all this stuff and how they train this is very shady at best, illegal at worst. So I am also very hesitant to even endorse this kind of stuff. But I'm saying once they get all the legal stuff taken care of, I think it can be a tool. Whether or not that tool is used for good, as in the writers now have access to something that'll help them research faster, whether it's, they have something to, try different ideas to help hone outlines and to essentially work and produce stuff faster. Because in that case, then if you're making more content, if you're focusing more on, writing as opposed to researching, and you have the ability to kind of figure out which direction you want to go with the script faster, you're going to get better much faster, and your stories are going to get better. I'm going to see this like creative growth kind of happen, which I've been hoping is going to happen in the movie industry after pretty much stagnation in the last 10 years. The downside is the studios kind of get a hold of this thing and say, well, I could write a script better than you. I can use AI to write a script better than you. And they fire all the writers, the people who really should be in charge of these things, the people who are creating the really creative story beats and really making these stories really good. And the studios are just like, we're going to do it ourselves, which, I mean, honestly, there's a lot of producers who think they can write better than a lot of writers. And, I can see that happening with a lot of studios. And that's a huge problem. Or you have one writer who just has the ability to just use AI to such an extent that they can just make a ton of content, and then all the jobs for writers are just much fewer. So you have people at the top at a much higher level, and they don't need a writer's room because they can bounce ideas off this AI. That's also a very scary thought, because once again, it's consolidation of ideas that is a scary thing. And I think if you have one person in charge or 6 studios in charge of this crazy AI stuff, and you only have 6 inputs or 6 people, 6 studio heads deciding where they go with content, you're going to take what we have now, which is just superhero movies and sequels, and you're going to 10x that to just even more honed in stuff that just strips creativity out of everything. So I'm really hoping that's not the case. So I do think that the writers have to figure out, number one, the AI should not be used to steal their content without their permission. That is just ridiculous. That's even been going on for the last 6-7 years with nobody, giving authority for this thing to take all this data is very alarming. And I think that the writers just need to make sure that there's, guardrails in place to make sure that this thing is used as a tool, that is used to help the writers to kind of spur this creativity, to kind of get us better content, as opposed to consolidation of content.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the scary factor. And that's going to go ahead and also wrap up this episode. I think, again, I do want to solidify my expectations here in saying that I firmly believe that this writer's strike will easily go past the 100 days. I think it's going to be at 200 days, which would be going into the new year. The only caveat I see is if you get the DGA and the SAG behind it, because I really just think, given the environment, given everything, both sides are going to dig their heels in. Again, solidarity for the writers. They deserve more, in my opinion. Creatives deserve more. But, being where we're at is just the fact of business and the element of it. It's really, really tough to see them caving without, them feeling it in the bottom line. And again, a lot of studios out there look at this and they go, oh, sweet, no expenses for writers now. And that will free up some content. They think they're fine. And let's explore AI, see how it can, consolidate everything. So you have that landscape and that environment. That being said, here at DBS Films, we're going to continue to do what we do best, just make movies for our fans with our fans. And because we are a full house production, we write for ourselves, we film for ourselves, we produce for ourselves. It will not affect us in the slightest. But again, solidarity to all the other creatives who are out there, because this is one heck of a crazy time, and we really hope that the creatives get what they deserve. That being said, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. Be sure to follow us online on our Discord channel. That's a place to be. We make movies for our fans with our fans. Take a look at The Force of Death, newest film. You watch it, you review it. It means the world to us, and it lets us continue to do what we love to do here. Till then, have a good one.